Hello everyone. As you know, my name is Maureen and this program is called Wise Up. So welcome. Today's topic, I hope you're going to enjoy it. It's about men and crying. So we're going to explore that a bit more. But previous topics we talked about was my sister and myself. We spoke about manhood, fatherhood. We also spoke about womanhood, being feminine, who identifies what femininity is. We also talked about self-identity. But now I thought it would be nice to home in, go into more depth on this topic of men crying. And I don't know whether you remember the song by Bashira. Way back, it was a reggae song way back in the day called Men Cry Too. And the question is, do they? And if they cry, do they do it in the open? Or is it all in secret? Or is it internal? So I did a bit of research on this. And bear with me, I'll show you what I've got on my phone. So what I've looked at is the repercussions of suppressed tears in men. And, you know, sometimes we think that this society today feel that men crying is a bit kind of wussy. You know, it's seen as them being weak. But who said it was weak? Where did this come from? And if that is believed, if men really believe that to cry is not the done thing, what does that do to them? Have you ever wondered? Have you ever seen, you know, the sort of the downfall of what happens? So it says here, suppressed tears in men, often a result of societal expectations around masculinity, can have profound emotional, psychological, and even physical repercussions. And it's given a breakdown of some of those psychological and emotional consequences. For instance, number one is increased anxiety and depression. You imagine it's like having so much stress and chaos in your life and you cannot vent it. That's like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. You know, and if that doesn't come out, there's no outlet, that must create depression and anxieties. So long-term emotional suppression keeps the body's stress response activated, leading to elevated cortisol levels, which are linked to anxiety, insomnia, and depression. You know, you imagine men having to cope with that. How do they manage in their jobs, in their relationships, having to deal with depression and anxiety? You know, that's not easy. Another repercussion is aggression and irritability. You know, you can't express your fears or your concern or your worries. So anger, it comes out as anger because it's exploding. And or irritability, you know, snapping at people all the time. You know, it says when soft emotions like sadness are suppressed, they often morph into hard-won anger, frustration, or even rage. You know, so sometimes some of the things we may be seeing from our menfolk is as a result of not being able to have that outlet emotionally. Also, you could have emotional numbness. Over time, men may lose touch with their emotional vocabulary, making it harder to identify or express feelings, which can lead to emotional detachment. As you can appreciate, women, we're emotional beings, and you know, we love to talk, but sometimes men will feel that they can't talk, they can't express their emotions because their emotions will be seen as being feeble or weak, and that is so sad. So they numb up and they go around looking solid, but deep inside they're crumbling. You know, I was talking to a colleague of mine and he was talking about how he was speaking to a woman about seeing her man crying and how she felt, what's he doing? What's he doing? Crying. It was seen as a cardinal sin, a big, massive crime, and to think the strength that it took that man to cry, the strength that it took him to cry, and in an environment where he felt he was safe, and to be deemed as less than and as weak, that's terrible. And it begs a question: what about that woman? What about her? What's her character like to sort of be belittling this man? Because to cry for a man is going against all the norms, and all his kind of his kind of men friends who don't cry. That's going against all those things to come to that point. His anguish, his passion, his emotion must have been so high and so unbearable. You know what I mean? So women, we gotta be more empathetic really and more understanding. You know, if a man cries, you've got to really support that and be empathetic and listen, because it's important to listen and understand where he's going through, what he's going through. So those were some of the emotional um, repercussions or consequences of suppressions of tears. It says here also the physical health, there's impacts there as well, where it can weaken your immune system. Can you believe that? Chronic stress from emotional suppression can impair the immune function, making the body more susceptible to illness. Wow. Also burnout and fatigue. Men who suppress emotions often push themselves harder at work or in life, leading to exhaustion and reduced creativity. That's that's quite heavy going, isn't it? And also relational and social effects like isolation and loneliness. Suppressing vulnerability shrinks support networks because the men don't want to talk to anybody, they don't want to open up, so they cut themselves off. So you don't have those networks of support anymore, and you're isolated and lonely. Men may avoid deep conversations or emotional intimacy, because can you imagine if you're in the company of that woman then and you want to talk about something so deep and wounding, you wouldn't dare talk about that, because if your emotions start to come to the surface, that person's going to laugh at you. They're going to make you feel smaller than anything. So what do? You suppress it, you bury it, and you internalize it. And that thing doesn't go away. It runs around your body and heaps more on top of it. Very destructive and very sad. It's a sad predicament to be in. So men may avoid deep conversations or emotional intimacy, which can erode relationships. Also, communication barriers, difficulty expressing emotions can hinder authentic connections with partners, friends, and family. Because, you think about a problem shared is a problem halved. If you're not sharing anything, you're distancing yourself. So there's no relationship really. Because relationship's about trusting as well, isn't it? And it's about sharing and understanding and empathy, all those things bottled into it. And if the man is feeling that he can't talk about those issues, he can't share them, he can't be emotional about them, can't cry, he can't cry. That's kind of hard. And even saying that word cry and using the male connected to that, it feels funny for me to even say it, because I know it's against the norm. But it's so sad, isn't it? So sad. So those are the things that we need to be mindful of. And men, find your safe space and cry. Go to the Licky Hills if necessary and bawl. You probably find other men up there doing the same thing. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Nothing to be ashamed of. And I suppose when you resist doing that, you're doing yourself more damage. You're doing yourself a whole lot more damage. So men crying isn't a bad thing. And granted, you don't want to see a man crying at every single juncture every single time, because then that would seem strange at a way, because there has to be a level of control as well, but you still should cry. It's a balance. Same with women, and women cry a lot. But I suppose you wouldn't want to see a woman crying all the time, because there's got to be some kind of emotional balance and resilience. But crying is not a bad thing. So where did this kind of feeling about men not crying come from? Because it has to have come from somewhere. Was it the way they were brought up? Or did parents tell them, mustn't cry? Was it their fathers set that example, that stoic example that, you don't cry, lad, stiff upper lip? Is it a cultural thing? Is it Britain talking about, like I said, the stiff upper lip? Or was it from, other countries as well, other cultures? What is the thought on that? Were you taught to cry as a man, that it wasn't a bad thing? I remember going on a trip with, I'm in a band, and we had a driver, and because he was talking about his son, and how his son was going through such very, very difficult situation. And you know what he said? He said he encouraged his son to cry. He encouraged his son to cry, and he told him it's healthy, it's not a bad thing, that's strength, and those are the languages we need to be using, isn't it? Ignore the sort of the hype around that men shouldn't cry. It's a negative thing, that is. I remember before, in one of the conversations we had, we talked about, what you saw in the media, the olden day males who were like John Wayne and I don't know, Sean Connery and all these guys. They didn't cry. I don't remember ever seeing them cry, and Clint Eastwood and all these famous people. If you've seen them cry, that would be great to know. But they set a pace and a model that so many people, so many men model themselves from. And I dare say you've got the new age men coming up now saying that those things aren't the right thing to do. The women are the ones who cry because they're weak and they're feeble. Like I can't remember the brothers' names now, but I think they kind of push that kind of mentality forward as well. That crying for men is a no-no. So let's look at repercussions. Sorry, where did this come from? This idea of men not crying. I've looked at it, so I'm going to share with you like a timeline. So bear with me. So the idea that men shouldn't cry has deep roots in the mix of culture, historical, and social factors. It's not just a modern Western thing, but a recurring theme across many societies. So it talked about ancient warrior culture. So, and this was like in Greece and Rome, Stoicism, especially in Rome, promoted emotional control as a sign of wisdom and strength. Warriors were expected to suppress fear, grief, and pain to remain effective in battle and to demonstrate virtue. Isn't that interesting? Spartan boys were trained to endure hardship without showing emotion. Crying was equated with weakness and shame. And samurais in Japan, Bishudo, emphasized composure and honor. Emotional restraint was part of maintaining dignity. And these are some of the norms that are around us today, you know, dignity, respect. Don't put yourself into no shame by crying like a woman. You can just hear those kind of rhetorics being said around us now. It says also patriarchal norms and power structures, mainly patriarchal societies, define masculinity in opposition to femininity. Since crying was associated with women, discouraging male tears reinforced a gender hierarchy. So it's them and us. Women cry, men don't. So in agrarian and later industrial societies, men were expected to be providers and protectors, roles imagined as requiring stoic endurance. So imagine if a man went and he worked his hard to earn money and he's walking home and he's lost, all of it's lost. He couldn't come home crying. He had to be stoic. He was a provider, you know. So you imagine that. I'd want to cry, wouldn't you? So religious and philosophical influences. It says Christianity, especially in the Middle East ages, it says, while the Bible shows male figures crying like David, and even Jesus, it says Jesus wept, doesn't it? Later church culture and often idealized male spiritual strength as resistantly bad, but letting them control you was seen as irrational and unmanly. Right, so then we got Victorian masculinity in the 19th century. Industrialization and empire building fueled a model of self-made man, rational, restrained, productive. Public crime became linked to loss of self-control, which was framed as unmanly. So you can see where all this is going, where all this stems from, you know. And then you got modern pop culture reinforcement. 20th century war propaganda portrayed soldiers as unflinching heroes. Hollywood action films and westerns idealized strong silent types, as I mentioned, John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. And boys were often told from a young age, big boys don't cry. I'm sure there was a song that said big boys don't cry as well. Big boys don't cry. I think, am I right or am I wrong? And creating a feedback loop of emotional suppression. So, you know, it's just so dangerous, isn't it, that, you know, tears aren't seen as something that's good in men. And it shows how those kind of things have been embodied throughout the ages, historical and historical, that's not the done thing. And that's very sad. So I'm just looking through my notes and make sure I've covered everything here. There was something else that I wanted to look at. Timeline, yeah, timeline from heroic tears to the strong silent type. 1200s to 1800 BC, Homeric epics, Iliad and Odyssey. Heroes like Achilles and Odyssey cry openly by fallen friends. Fallen friends. So they cried during that time, men cried. So that was in the 1200s to 1800s BC. Crying is a public display of loyalty, grief, and moral worth. So what? So something's changed. Way back then, that was okay. But moving further on, we're seeing that things have changed. 10,000, so in 1000 BCE, biblical traditions, David weeps for Saul and for Jonathan. Crying shows love, devotion, and righteousness. Medieval era, tears of honor, 500 to 1500 CE. Kings in Arthurian legends and Chanson's digestry cry over death, betrayal, or love. Tears are part of an idealized masculinity, combining courage with emotional depth. I'm going to read that again. Tears are part of an idealized masculinity, combining courage with emotional depth. So men, you can be courageous, but to cry shows emotional depth as well. That is strength. That is strength. So Renaissance and early modern controlled emotion. So that's the 1500s and the 1600s. Court of Europe emphasized decorum. Crying is acceptable only in proper context, like funerals, great tragedy. Early Stoic revival promotes self-mastery. Shakespeare's male heroes still cry, King Lear, Othello, but restraint is emerging as a virtue. So you can see now the gradual changes. 18th to 19th century, rise of Stoic gentlemen. 1700s, Enlightenment, ideas prize reason over emotions. Soldiers and leaders, modern emotional control. Model emotional control. And you've got Napoleonic Wars, that's the 1800s. Romantic poetry still shows men weeping, but military heroism is starting to prize unshakable composure. So you see the gradual change. Victorian era, stiff upper lip becomes a British ideal, spreading through the empire. Crying is refrained as unmanly, except in private. 20th century, no tears allowed. World War 1914 to 1918, trench warfare creates a culture of silent endurance. Men traumatized by shell shock are told to toughen up. Sorry, it makes me feel like crying because when you think of what those men went through during the war and the things they saw, many of those men came back totally mashed up, for want of a better word. And they were told to stiffen up their lip, don't talk about it, don't shed no tears. Many of those men went into Great Depression, beat up their wives, probably even killed their wives because they couldn't talk about what they went through. They couldn't cry. Because you were told don't shed no tears, and you couldn't be crying on the on the battleground. Some of those men were children going out to war, little boys. The mum was still tucking their shirts and they couldn't cry. Painful. So public grief is minimized to keep morale. World War II, propaganda heroes are stoic, smiling through adversity. You know, you can imagine those pictures, what they were showing, you know, that we want you, you know, we want heroes, people who are strong and, you know, um, it's sad. And the way they portrayed it in films as well, you know, army films, the men were brave, you know, facing the war, coming back as heroes. You know, a lot of those men came back half human, if you want to say that, the things they'd done, the things they'd seen, and nobody really spoke about those things and nobody really seemed to care, you know. Even now when we see the poppies, you know, they're celebrating, you know, the war days and whatever, you don't hear those stories. They talk about bravery as if bravery was something that didn't involve wanting to cry, shedding emotions, and the after effects of war. You know, those things need to be spoken about because when they're not spoken about and they're romanticized, you know, there's wars going on even now as we speak, you know, and they're clothed in, you know, romanticism and, you know, strong hero, brave men, heroes, wonderful, but they're not all that. They're horrible. Horrible. War is horrible and so unnecessary. So post-war pop culture, that's the 1950s. Strong silent type dominates, and I mentioned the you know, the actors like John Wayne and Eastwood, and Boys Told Don't Cry as part of gender conditioning. And I know that's always happened, even in our families, when the boys were being scolded or whatever, the boys were told, stop crying, you've got nothing to cry about, you know, and it's not a positive thing. So late 20th to 21st century pushback and partial return. Men's liberation movement encourages emotional openness. So that's in the 1970s. And I dare say that was probably when Bashara came out with their song as well, 70s to 80s. And sports stars celebrate crying in public, start to normalize male tears. Well, you've seen them on the football pitch, haven't you? You know, men are crying now when their team loses. those are seen as normal, I suppose. But I dare say, still a man crying over something else, I'm not sure that is really still seen as a norm. And 2000, mental health awareness campaigns challenge stoicism as strength. Social media amplifies acceptance in some circles, but stigma remains in certain subcultures. So those were some of the highlights of how the male emotions was initially back in the 800s accepted. But you've seen the gradual changes, how it's changed during coming up to modern day times when it's not seen as the norm and it's not the done thing. And it's so sad, isn't it? Because our males are suffering. We're seeing many of our males in the mental health system as well. You know what I mean? And there's a whole reason to that too. Because even like, I could talk about like black males because I did a study on that when I was doing my social work studies, and I wanted to find out why were so many black males, when I say black males I mean Asian as well, men of color, why were most of them in the mental health system, and even in the prison system. And I dare say part of that too is because they suppress their emotions, and being in an environment where you're experiencing racism, and you can't even talk about that because it doesn't exist. It's a figment of your imagination, or it's a chip on your shoulder. All those things aren't healthy. But yes, I know that our white colleagues, white males, they suffer from not crying as well, and being told from their fathers, who were told by their fathers, stiff upper lip lad, especially in the war days, they were told that as well. You know, those things aren't healthy. And, it does affect our male mental health. And we have to be mindful of the language we use and the way we treat males or male folks when we see them having an emotional outburst or crying. We got to be mindful that we support them really, and we create that safe environment. And the language we use as well is the right language. There's something that's called emotional literacy, and it's how are we treating our males when they do show emotions, and even our males as well. How do they handle crying? They have to be. It talks about male literacy here. It says self-awareness. They need to have that self-awareness about themselves, and being able to put a language to their emotions too. Why do you feel that way? Do they explore the range of their emotions? Do they know what the triggers are? All those things need to be looked into rather than buried and felt, I can't show emotions. I've got to be strong. I can't be weak. You've got to be able to explore those things and understand them, and be also able to express them. Some of my young folks, men that I've spoken to, they struggle to express their emotions. Why are you feeling that way? I don't know. Can you put it into words? I can't put it into words. I just feel that way. I just feel a bit lackluster. You've got to be able to explain those things. You've got to be able to unpick it in a way that's clear so it could be understood by others. And also empathy is understanding other people's range of emotions as well, because that enables you to understand your own. So when you can see someone like a woman, say, crying, sit down and listen to what she's saying and understand from her perspective what the triggers are, what's happening for her, what are the circumstances, what are the fears. Understand it. What is the background history? What is the context? Because all these things come into play. And when you can understand that from an empathetic level, it enables you to understand your own emotional range. And there's also regulation. It's managing your emotions in a healthy way. Managing your emotions in a healthy way. And by that, I mean, like, some men then will feel that, okay, I'm grieving. But anyone who comes into my territory, I'm going to knock them out because, I'm not happy. Ugh. Is that the right approach? Is that the right approach? You know, grieving. You got to be able to talk about what you're feeling and cry it out, but obviously in a safe environment. You create that safe environment. You create the safe friends that you can do that with. I remember I got a friend who had a reunion with all his male mates from school days. And I remember him saying that, they all got together and they spoke because they hadn't been together. He's in his 70s. All right. So school days, that's way back when they were like 16, probably younger than 16. And they came from all corners and they came together. And he said when they spoke, they caught up on each other's stories. They laughed. They cried. They literally cried about things they'd been through, what none of the others necessarily knew as well, or what they all shared. They cried, laughed, talked, reminisced, and he said it was cathartic, it was healthy, it was enriching, and nobody looked at the other person as if they came from Mars because everybody was on the same page. All the men were on that same page. Whether they'll go out and do that in a public arena, that's another thing. But knowing the man who spoke to me about that, I knew where he was coming from because I knew his story. And for him to be able to be unburdened and unfettered to cry, I thought that was a blessing. So my message really is to men out there, young and old, like the 70-year-old who could cry, him and his mates could cry. I'm talking to the young guys as well. I don't know how you guys feel about shedding tears. I've got young men as my boys in my life, my sons, and I know I don't know if I've seen them cry. Probably I could probably say on one hand, and I'd have to look really hard to find a finger. And my husband, I'm trying to think. I think I probably only seen him cry once. Oh, once even at a movie and he was like wiping it away quickly because he didn't want it. And then he was laughing at me. You're crying, Maureen. You're crying. Of course, I was crying, but I know he was as well. But he was wiping it away. So it's a funny thing, isn't it? It's how do we women support our men, right, to feel free and liberated to cry. That's important because we have to do our part, women. We have to do our part. But men, you have to feel free as well and know that it's not something where you lack courage. That is strength. That is strength to be able to cry. It takes courage. And when you cry, even as fathers, when you cry, you set a model for your sons that that's okay to do that, son, because it lets out the stress, it lets out the pressure, and it lets out the tension so that you can cope. It's almost like it's resilience. That's what tears is, Showing emotions is resilience. Now, some people think, you got to get vicious, you got to get angry, you got to thump out a few lights. That's not it. You imagine you're with your partner as well. You're with your partner and you're feeling emotional and you decide you're going to be angry, and you allow that to really explode. Someone gets hurt. Someone gets hurt. It's not right. And it's normally the woman, and that's where we get domestic violence and so on and so forth. Because men, you have to handle your emotions, you got to handle your anger. Walk out the room. Walk out the room. Take care of your business. But when it comes to crying, you've got to do that as well. Let out steam. Be free. So that's what some of the things I wanted to talk about, really, about emotions and male crying. And Bashira saying, men cry too. You know, when you had a heartbreak, do you cry? Do you cry? Some men don't. You've heard of men in the news who've experienced heartbreak. So what do they go and do? They find a woman and they take her out. Those things aren't healthy. Those things aren't healthy. You know, I've known of someone who's, well, right, they had mental health, but they've hurt the person because they couldn't handle their emotions. You know, and it's a strong man who can handle his emotions, who knows when to cry, knows when to laugh, knows when to be firm, knows when to be controlled anger. Because you can have anger, but you have to be controlled. You can't lose it because then you've lost it. You have no control. Do you understand me? That is where strength is, having a control over the whole range of your emotions. The whole range of emotions. And tears is one of those. Yeah? Crying is one of those. You cry, the appointed time, you cry. So it's basically what I want to say as well is that men, you need to be getting together and you need to be talking with each other as well. Honest conversations. And older men with younger men. We want that generational bond to take place. The gaps need to be closed. You know, we want the men to be coming alongside as mentors as well and sharing, because the next generation, you know, they need it, and the women need men who can be emotional. You know, we need men who can be emotional as well. Emotional intelligence is vital because the world needs it as a whole as well. Society needs it. You know, we're tired of listening to the rubbish and the hype that's been conveyed through music and the media and TV and films. Tired of it. Thing is that we got to switch it up. Got to wise up. Got to wise up and start reading, researching, knowing more. Like I've just gone through a bit of the history about crying and not crying. But you didn't know that. But you didn't know those things came from way back, and how crying was a norm for men before, and bit by bit it's eroded. But now people want to come back and say, no, men need to cry because we see the damage it's doing. You know, these things are important. So I hope you've enjoyed this little session we've had today. You know, so as I would always say, like, subscribe. I always forget the other bit, but you know, put your comments in and things you want us to talk about or me to talk about or research and whatever and discuss. Please let me know. But thank you so much for spending the time with me with Wise Up.